just pass the screen to Dorcas and Peter.
Okay.
Dorcas, over to you.
Thanks. So thanks very much, and I think there's actually some interesting synergies that I hope you'll hear about. It's great to be here and to speak to this group, and I just wanted to update you on some things that we're doing, the updates or perhaps the upgrades to the OMERACT way of instrument selection for core outcome sets that have led to what we're going to be calling the OMERACT Filter 2.2. So I know a lot of you know about OMERACT, but just to highlight some of the key features, this founded in 1992, so we're approaching our 30th birthday. We commit to an independent international representation on all of our groups, and that they have to be multi-stakeholder. So health professionals, researchers, we always involve patient research partners in our work, and other groups like regulators, etc. And our core outcome sets are evidence or data driven and then consensus based. So we seek consensus on the final sets. We're also involved because of our work where we might find gaps, developing and validating clinical or radiographic outcome measures for rheumatic diseases, and then developing and advancing methods, working with people like you to advance the methods on core outcome set development and implementation. So the foundation of OMERACT is this filter, and this is right back from the beginning in 92. We've always said that an instrument has to be, the score of an instrument has to be able to have validity evidence to say that it can show truth, discrimination between groups of interest, and that's feasible to apply. So in 2014 and 2018, we found ourselves faced with a growing body of literature, and like many others, had to figure out a process to operationalize the goal of the pillars. So we developed processes for managing this literature and creation of evidence to fill any gaps in our filter. We've developed reporting frameworks so that we tried to get consistent reporting and set up templates for summaries and posters. And then guidelines for searches, performance assessment, synthesis, and quality assessment were developed. Now in 2020, we're moving into the filter 2.2. We've moved a number of measures through 2.1 and 2.0 and have groups that are being mentored through a lot of different instrument selection processes. But another feature of our committee, of our process, is that the community helps each other. So as we start moving different types of instruments through the process, we started to realize that it's not quite a good fit for certain things. And so we started moving imaging outcomes through the OMERACT filter. And as we did that, we found that it was a bit of an uncomfortable fit. And so rather than having different processes for the different types of instruments like this, we spent literally 3 years of regular meetings and face-to-face and telephone conferences to talk about how they differed. And then in the end, what we realized is that OMERACT as a whole could learn from imaging outcomes. And if we expanded our filter a little bit, then we would all benefit. And that's what I wanted to highlight for you today. So like everybody here, we really split the core outcome set creation into what to measure and then how to measure it. So we begin with our domain set creation, moving through generating, agreeing, and at OMERACT, all the core sets have to come to an OMERACT meeting for endorsement and voting. And then typically at OMERACT, what we've been looking at is our infamous OMERACT onion, which organizes the domains, and the ones down in the mandatory domains are what form the core set. So the ones that are very important. But it also gives a way to say, well, here are some important domains that didn't quite make it into a mandatory status, but things you might want to think about when you're designing a trial or might be important for a specific question. And then the outer ring is the research agenda, which shows things that the working group are working on. So it might end up being an important domain and recommend it for a core set later on, but there's just not enough understanding of that concept or enough body of evidence to have it move into the core mandatory domains. So each of these domains would have a statement about their definition, but what we were finding is that the statements became simple, and that's good, but then over time, by the time we got to an instrument, we lost the richness of the understanding of that domain definition. So as we went to imaging, we realized that one thing that imaging does very well, and our first lesson for Filter 2.2, So they do very detailed definitions. So we start with the green box, the core area, which is things like maybe a pathophysiological manifestation in an imaging. And then they talk about, well, what do they want to measure? And it might be a very broad label, something like inflammation. Well, but what can this actual technique in imaging actually pick up? And that might be for something like ultrasound. We're finding that they would be saying, well, inflammation from an ultrasound perspective is often a synovitis. That's what we can capture well with ultrasound. And so then they actually go into that even more detail. So what exactly on ultrasound are you going to see to quantify this thing called synovitis as a marker of inflammation for a pathophysiological manifestation? And they might get into things like blood flow or thickness of the synovium. So they have these multi-layered definitions. And we looked at those also from the idea of PRO and realized that this type of thing could be useful for any outcome, that we might have these broader labels, but then we really need to drill down into a thing like physical functioning. So in the end, you get what would physical functioning in that inner box look like? What things need to be in a good measure of physical functioning? And this is before an instrument, so this is still at the domain selection level. So what we've done is tried to apply this to all outcomes. And this is far too much detail to read, but I'd be happy to circulate this. But the domain groups for each outcome that they are talking about in their onion, in the mandatory rings of their onion, we're asking them to first name the target domain and the intended, like the PICO up at the top, then tell us about the domain at the core area, broad, target. So really give us some rich definitions. The target domain might be the label, and then the working definition might be equivalent to what Paul is describing as that lay summary for inclusion in a Delphi type of process. But then we're asking them to actually go drill down even further into the domain components to give us a range of all the different things you want to be able to see in this instrument. To actually give some qualitative, a lot of our groups have gone into qualitative studies or a rich description of the literature. So put in some quotes here from patients or from stakeholders that really tell us about the breadth and depth of their experience with this. What does a mild look like? What does a severe look like? And then a final thing we're asking them to tell us about is, as you're moving through this whole process, you've probably encountered sources of variability, which is a term we're using to sort of talk about the things that are at play in measurement that could affect the score that you get. Is there a difference between raters that you're encountering, or between the machine that you use? Or are there certain patient factors that might make it easier or harder to capture this? So these sources of variability might come up at the domain level. They'll certainly come up as we're exploring instruments. And so we're asking for this sheet to be completed. And then this sheet is going to go forward into the instrument selection phase as the basis for instrument selection. So it will define the content that you are aiming for in a good instrument. And that sometimes was lacking. Our instrument selection process is not changing from 2.1, but there's some details in it that will change. But just to remind people that we do instrument, we ask people to identify instruments. They choose candidate instrument that's going to move through the filter selection. And then first thing they do is a very quick review. Is it a match for that domain, comparing it to that definitional sheet? And is it feasible to use in the context of use? And then if it is that, then they move forward to a more systematic review of the available evidence, the measurement property reviews. But if it isn't that, then nothing's going to be able to fit if it doesn't match the concept, or if it's just impossible to use in the context of use. So those instruments are set aside and other instruments are considered. So then a systematic review is done, and I'll show you some of our summary tables, the summary of measurement property tables. One thing we uniquely do is that in the systematic review, if there's a gap, we will actually help people to design studies to fill that gap. Along the way, we have a technical advisory group that mentors the group through this whole process so that they can have success in the end, and that we help them with methods and how to synthesize their evidence. Then it still needs to go to the broader OMERACT community for a final endorsing vote of the working group's recommendation. So one thing we've done in Filter 2.2 is move from a previous checklist to a more process-oriented checklist. So this will be the checklist that is out for the groups, and they just keep ticking as they move through the process. So it's a really good communication tool for us to see where groups are at, and also for them to make sure that they don't go too far without having made a decision, for example, of whether there's a domain match and whether it's feasible. They'll do that before they get into the heavy duty doing a review of the literature. We've also developed a number of videos, whiteboards, and workbooks to help support this process. And this is our infamous summary of measurement property table, our SOMP, as we like to call it. And I just wanted to, it's something that we've used before, but we've done some revisions for it for Filter 2.2. Up at the top of it, we're asking people to give us their PICO statement so that that PICO stays with the SOMP. So anybody picking up this one-page summary of the state of evidence for this instrument knows exactly what the intended PICO was, in case there might have been a different scope of patients than somebody else wants to look at this same instrument for. We also put the date that it was completed so people can know the currency of that. The other thing that we're doing is we've updated the array of measurement properties that are included in our summary of measurement property tables. And then I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. I'm happy to go back to this if anybody wants me to break down how we create this table, but it's trying to get an overall lay of where the evidence came from, what the findings were, how good the quality of the evidence was, and then finally what at the bottom, what the working group is recommending, whether this instrument has passed the filter or not. So the measurement properties that we have of interest are the ones that help us tell whether an instrument is going to be good in the context of a clinical trial or a longitudinal observational study, which are the foci of OMERACT. So we tend to look at these types of measurement properties. But that led us into lesson number 2 from imaging, that we need to identify those sources of variability that are impacting the score that we're getting on our outcome measurement instruments and see if there's a solution. So of course in imaging they run into inter-rater reliability, inter-machine variability, the mode of administration. So we're asking all the groups, as I mentioned earlier, to look at those sources of variability and come back and see if they're having an impact on your score, and if they are, what kind of solution might you have. So if there are differences between raters, then only trained raters tested for their agreement will be used in this study so that we come up with some recommendations to try to get more precision in our scores. So that meant that in our box of reliability, we're increasing the sense of that reliability. So if a group has found raters might be a difficulty, then we're asking them to assess and provide evidence on inter-rater reliability or inter-reader on an imaging, inter-machine or inter-setting. And those are assessed as needed. So our final lesson from imaging outcomes that we're bringing to all of OMERACT is that with these tweaks, just a couple of improvements, we can apply the OFISA, our OMERACT Filter Instrument Selection Algorithm. There's a quiz at the end for all of the acronyms, to almost all the different outcomes in OMERACT. So we're working with just a few adjustments. The use of the domain definitions that will give us a basis for content validity. The sources of variability are now explicitly named and dealt with, either by assessing their impact or coming up with a way of dealing with it. And then new types of reliability have been added. These lessons fit in up in the top parts. These are our 4 signaling questions of our filter in the instrument selection algorithm. And these the first 2 lessons have an impact right up around match with target domain, practicality, if there's a lot of sources of variability, and then the reliability feeding into do the numeric scores make sense. These are all then pulled together. The information from the workbooks is reviewed by the technical advisory group for their accuracy, and that the claims that they're making are based on the data that they've presented on terms of their quality appraisal and the number of studies they have, etc. They prepare background reading and presentations online. We have discussion boards for each of these instruments. And then summaries are made for patients. They're presented to the OMERACT community. And then the recommendation of the working group is endorsed or not. And it goes forward into a publication. So in 2.2, you'll see more emphasis on definitions, looking for those sources of variability, and then just an adjusted OFISA to accommodate these different types of outcome. And we're just rolling out the revised handbook. We have a number of instrument groups that are working with it now to help us tweak up what's going on and how we can improve it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dorcas. People with questions? We're all busy focusing, so the chat went right off there, Dorcas, as well.
Oh. I had a question for the first group, and I was wondering whether those definitional tables and providing that much more sort of meat to the definition would be a helpful starting point for some of the HOD outcomes.
So just a quick comment from me. One thought I had when I was seeing the slides is that aspect of impact, for example, as a domain relating to the consequences, that it could be informative for actually defining that part of the, or creating that part of the health outcome descriptor. So for sure, in terms of thinking about sources of these definitions, existing instruments, and existing sources of information would be useful. In the guideline panels where we use the health outcome descriptors, we largely relied on the clinical experience and expertise of the panel members. And again, as Robbie mentioned, there's more steps we could probably do in terms of validation and how to develop these health outcome descriptors. What are the best ways? And I could see that being an informative piece to actually go back to looking at the measurement instruments and having these domains, for example, being informative for drafting a health outcome descriptor.
Yeah, I think it would help us definitely to be more specific in our descriptions. So a lot of them are still quite general in terms of describing testing and treatment, especially, I think.
Donna, you look.
Well, my mind was jumping back to the earlier conversation, which I'm still processing. And one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about that we started to talk about, but I don't think we really pulled out all the implications. In the conversation that we had earlier, I sensed sort of a shifting in the way we were, in the meaning of the word outcome, depending on who was saying it. And so, you know, you take something like a pulmonary embolism, that's an outcome, certainly in the guideline world, in the sense that it is a diagnosed event that a patient experiences, right? And so you're characterizing that experience and building sort of a definition and specific information about it. In the core outcome world, it depends on the specific context of clinical trials that you're creating a core outcome set for, right? So a pulmonary embolism would often be treated, I think, as someone said, as an adverse event, something that you're measuring in clinical trial as something that you don't want to happen but might, or if it is a primary outcome in a trial and you're assessing how many of these events take place, then it's because you have an intervention that is designed specifically to prevent that from happening. And so whether or not you consider it an outcome in a core outcome set really depends on the clinical context and the context of the trials that you're talking about. And so we, you know, I think we have to be careful in thinking about what we mean by outcome, because it's changing according to the context.
We were finding that too, Donna, and that's one reason why at the top of our tables we've added in like that they have to keep on repeating their PICO. Like, what are the interventions that you're thinking about when you're setting up this core outcome set or considering this instrument?
Yeah, and so that's why I mean, and Robbie, I really appreciated the presentation. It was very interesting, and it's given us a lot to think about. But this is why sort of the framework
Right.
In some cases, looks like it almost fits a well-specified outcome, and with some specification for measurement, and other places doesn't.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand that. What we're trying to do is to describe the outcome, no matter in which context the outcome occurs, it should be the same outcome. Just the relative importance to that specific setting or that specific population could be different. But we're trying to standardize it across groups and settings.
Right. No, which is, I think, really valuable. But, you know, it struck me, you know, in some cases for a core outcome set, the, you know, respiratory features or something would be, as Peter pointed out, you know, might be the outcome that you're measuring rather than the actual event of a pulmonary embolism. I don't know. I was just trying to draw out the implications more of that sliding of meaning that I was seeing in the conversation.
I mean, I can definitely see the link between the definitions of pulmonary embolism in terms of symptoms. I think for purposes of guideline developers though, and therefore patients making decisions, all of that information that you have in a descriptor is really helpful, but that isn't the same use as a core outcome set in a trial. And I think you have more in there than a core outcome set developer might need to develop a core outcome set, but there is at least a link, and it would seem to make sense to try and explore how standardized that bit could be, that first bit. Caroline's got her hand up, and then Jan.
Yeah, I couldn't find the raise hand function anymore in Zoom. It seems to have disappeared somehow, so I have to raise my physical hand, which is...
It's easier to see, because I'm not
the old-fashioned way, Caroline.
It's difficult with the virtual background. And anyway, I just wanted to make a short comment to Dorcas in her presentation. I'm very happy to see that you're working on these outcome or domain definitions. We've tried to incorporate this in our COSMIN COMET guideline that Paula was involved for the selection of measurement instruments as a first step, but somehow not many cost developers picked up what we really meant by this step, because we always had some discussion, but we've already defined the outcomes. So why is that step necessary? And I think, well, you're making the same point that we need more. And I think it also refers to the first presentation. We need more than just the name of an outcome. We need a description. So I look forward to see how that works out in the future. And I was also interested in your second point about the sources of variability. Well, you might have seen our COSMIN publication that came out, I think, this year about the new boxes for reliability, which was partly based on the same information because MADA was involved in that project as well. Yeah. So we also based this on the imaging as an example, but from a slightly different perspective, because we were looking at the quality of reliability studies, and you are looking at the quality of the instruments and the application of the instruments. So I think that could be interesting for future collaboration to see how those two sources can be used together, and how that, and I'm particularly interested to see how this is picked up by the cost developers in your case, and also the people validating instruments, because I think it's a very complex discussion, and many it's very hard to explain how these sources of variation, what it actually is, and why it's so important. So I look forward to well, to see your experiences with that.
Yes, it is really hard. It's very complex.
Yeah.
But
Jan?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. So I just wanted to emphasize what Donna also mentioned. I think this is a very nice group that we have guideline developers, cost developers, trialists, experts in certain disease areas. And generally speaking, it is really, really difficult to use one and the same concept, let's say outcome or outcome domain or whatever, but knowing that different people use it in a different context, define it differently, and so on. So I'm not necessarily talking about us, so we are all more or less aware of these differences, but it's so hard for students to explain this. And at the end of the day, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is, and I also really liked the image you presented, Robbie, with this circles. So at the end of the day, so in an ideal world, a trialist would have the same understanding and measure what is really important. This is then picked up by the systematic reviewer. And in an ideal world, we have high quality systematic reviews that can be directly used for guideline development. So the point is that I don't know how. So of course there are linkages and connections, but I want to emphasize, isn't this group a useful starting point to address these issues? So I have no solution, but I know that we discussed this last time already and say, okay, it's a complex topic. Yes, it is, but I think it is so important. So it's, and it's not only the concept of an outcome or a domain. So there are some initiatives use area, outcome area, and some use different things. And it is very, very challenging to, well, to always keep up to date what is actually meant by whom and by which initiative. So, and this is a major challenge.
So for me, terminology is less important than what the words actually mean. So the idea that we might take some examples and show, I think that would be really helpful to people trying to use core outcomes in a trial or use core outcomes in a guideline. I really like the idea that's been going on in the chat about actually, you know, linking up some descriptors, plain language definitions, but actually also then moving it through Dorcas and Caroline, you know, right through to the how, because I think Sean said this years ago when I first met him, but it is the penny has completely and utterly dropped with me now. Karen Hughes has been interviewing trialists about their use or lack of use of an existing core outcome set, and not having the instruments or definitions to take off the shelf and implement it in their trial is a killer blow, and is causing them, you know, so much extra work that they almost dismiss the core outcome set to start with. If it doesn't, you know, they don't want to do the work themselves, even though they probably are doing it for non-core outcomes. So it's yeah, I think the more that this group can actually say this how is all, you know, it's all vital and crucial, and here's a way to do it, and we're all agreed on that. Yeah, we've noticed there, haven't we? People are now registering their how protocols because, you know, there has been this enormous growth in the what, you know, and they're all published, and a slow trickle to the next stage, but a few things are coming through now. I think the biggest problem we have is the funding, because and personally, I'm going to talk to the NIHR to almost say, don't fund another core outcome set unless they do the how as well as the what, and you're just going to have to give them more money. I haven't quite dared to say that yet. I need to speak to Hal Williams, because although he's not involved, you know, but it feels like that. And Sean, you definitely said that 6-7 years ago, but
give us more money to standardize the instruments, so we don't need to do all these systematic reviews. just have one set of good instruments would be very helpful.
So this has been really great. Does anybody have any final questions, comments for the speakers? There was a request to share slides. Dorcas, are you in a position to share, or do we need to wait for the...
Yep. No, I've sent them on to Sarah, so she's got a copy of those slides. And then I've sent along just some KT. I think picking up on that point though, Paul, I fully agree with the KT part of it, sort of the really trying to make sure these get in the right hands and
okay.
make it usable.
Hopefully there will be lots of further discussions. Now we're all understanding specific projects we're each working on. We do need a couple of volunteers for the next session. Hopefully people are enthused. You don't need to say now, but Sarah does need to know in order to then find some possible dates. One thing, John's had to leave, but just to say, so he put an email, he put a message to the chat, which was actually something that I was talking to him about. It kind of all links to the idea of getting outcome measurement into routine care better. In the UK, we're really trying to look at that. And one of the issue is metadata and standards for metadata, which is where CDISC are involved. And Caroline, I don't know if you've had involved, but I was asking John about CDISC and PROMs in terms of the metadata and what their requirements are. And he said they were doing quite a lot on that. So it could be, if it's of interest, John does something about that, because it definitely relates to this how. If you subsequently want to be able to record these things routinely and store the data and share it, then this metadata piece that CDISC is all about is really crucial, and it's really problematic for PROs, I think. But you may know more. Okay.
I don't know much about that. No, not yet.
It's thinking even further beyond a trialist.
I'm happy to hear more about it.
It's being able to then share that data on with anybody if you haven't got a metadata dictionary, and the PRO bit is really challenging. So yeah, okay. So does people want to volunteer to Sarah outside of the meeting, and then we'll try and sort something out? Apologies, Sean, for the very early